So, very good evening, one and all. Very good evening, seniors, juniors, and peers. Very good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We've joined here once again today for an academic feast to follow. As we all know, there have been a couple of conferences that have just got over very recently and which bring forth the latest updates in diabetes management. Uh, the ICMR InDive study was just out, published in the Lancet approximately a month back, and figures were quite bleak for us. As you all know, the diabetes burden was more than 101 million, pre-diabetes 136 million, and challenges to us are unique, being having a very thin fat phenotype, having atherogenic dyslipidemia, other clustering of events, so on and so forth. So, to empower ourselves in our practice, what becomes important is to uh, take the best of information, the latest of information, translate that into learnings, knowledge, and ultimately implement it for the best patient care, for whom we have today the best of minds together coming in a single podium. I have the honor of introducing our esteemed faculty for the day. At the outset, I have the honor of introducing Dr. Sanjay Kalra sir, who's one of the most reputed endocrinologists in the country and a consultant at Bharti Hospital, Karnal. He's currently the president of the CEPHIS and has also been the past president of the ESI. He's also chairperson of the Education Working Group of the ISC, president of the IPATH, and editor-in-chief of the ESI Textbook of Endocrinology. He is also the secretary and section editor of EndoText, the PubMed Index textbook. And as we all know, he has numerous publications in peer-reviewed indexed medical journals. We also have the honor of introducing and inviting our esteemed speaker for the day, Dr. John Bose himself, who, as we all know, is one of the key researchers and one of the best highly cited researchers in the world, as he has also been recognized by the Thomson Reuters. His areas of interest being treatment of type 1 diabetes, type 2 diabetes, and their complications, with numerous affiliations, including the AACE, the ADA, the Endocrine Society, and the Society of General Internal Medicine. He's authored more than 400 publications, ladies and gentlemen, and has them to his credit. Last but not the least, we have, again, one of the most reputed endocrinologists from our country, Dr. Ganpati Bantwal himself, who's currently professor and head of the Department of Endocrinology at St. John's Medical College, Bengaluru. He's been the past president of the Karnataka Endocrine Society, as well as the past president of the Endocrine Society, and has also bared numerous other positions, including past treasurer and secretary in these respective bodies. He's also been a past vice president of the Karnataka RSSDI and has won numerous awards during his career till date. He's published more than 100 publications in peer-reviewed national as well as international journals and has been a principal investigator in greater than 80 clinical trials. So, with such an esteemed panel, and without wasting any more time, I hand over the session to our esteemed moderator, Dr. Kalra. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Partha, and good evening, everyone who is logged in today. Now, we are living in exciting times because even though modern diabetes or modern diabetes care can be said to be about 100 years, never in the past 100 years has so much gone on, so much change at the same time. We have newer advances in pathophysiology, in diagnostics, in management. We are now able to talk about prevention of type 1 diabetes, and we are also able to talk about prevention of complications of diabetes in a much more confident manner. And when we look back, when Professor Ganpati and I look back at our life in endocrinology, when we joined the subject of endocrinology, there was no proof, actually, that treating type 2 diabetes would be of benefit to anyone on earth. That proof came later. And when we were doing our fellowship, we remember the endless debates that took place after UKPDS. Is it even worthwhile managing type 2 diabetes or not? Coming from then, and coming from a time when the diagnostic criteria of diabetes were not properly laid down, there was argument about that as well. Coming from then to today, when we are much more confident, when we can actually help our fellow citizens, it's a great feeling to have. We also have with us Dr. John Bewes, who is younger than us because he has more experience of youth than us. Dr. Bewes, what do you think about that? The experience of youth, does it grow with age or does it come down?
Oh, no, it definitely grows with age. But there's something to be said about youth and the sort of openness to new ideas. So hopefully we have a lot of young people on this call as well.
That's right. Point well taken. So youth is not just about the chronological age that you have. Youth is about cognitive attitudes, approaches, behaviors to what is new in science. And I think let's all bring this youth, this vitality, this vigor into today's discussion. We welcome Dr. John Bewes and welcome to India. He'll be speaking to us about latest trends, current advances in diabetes care, in diabetes research as well. And then we'll have a panel discussion with him and Professor Bantwal. Feel free to shoot your questions, your comments. Your criticism is also welcome because that helps us remain young. I speak on Dr. Bewes' behalf as well. And so, Dr. Bewes, we have an audience from across the country, across India, all waiting to listen to you. What is new? What is exciting? What is youthful about diabetes care and research this year?
Well, I think you've framed it beautifully, and I'll share my screen to show you some slides. So I've entitled this Recent Advances in Diabetes and Research, dated today, July 2nd, 2023. And the hope is that we can have this as an ongoing effort between the United States and India to share updates that come about month by month.
That's a good idea.
Here are my disclosures. Our unit does a lot of work for the pharmaceutical industry, and I've listed the companies that I work with here. Basically, it's most of them in the diabetes space, at least in the United States. And this presentation is going to be a compilation of a presentation I was asked to make at the American Diabetes Association's 83rd Scientific Sessions just last week. The title that I was given was Major Advances and Discoveries in Diabetes, the Year in Review. And I will also highlight what I think the big stories were from the American Diabetes Association this year. I'm going to do things in a little bit of a different order, mostly updates from the year in review around type 1 diabetes, gestational diabetes and complications, and then a little bit of a deeper dive in type 2 diabetes and some of the presentations that were made at the American Diabetes Association meeting. The big news in type 1 diabetes over the last year was first the US FDA's approval of teplizumab. It's a monoclonal antibody, an anti-CD3. Various formulations of anti-CD3 have been shown to be active in the setting of new onset diabetes in preserving C-peptide. The excitement around teplizumab was related to treating people with so-called stage 2 type 1 diabetes, which basically is impaired glucose tolerance in the setting of autoimmune markers for type 1 diabetes. In the study, there was a delay in the onset of type 1 diabetes on the order of a year to two. Just in the last couple of months, the Food and Drug Administration in the United States approved teplizumab to reduce the rate of progression of type 1 diabetes in patients with stage 2 type 1 diabetes. And we'll talk later what I think the implications are of this approval, which will drive a further effort to screen for type 1 diabetes before its onset, with the idea that we have the opportunity perhaps to delay and maybe even prevent in some patients the development of type 1 diabetes. There have been global approvals for multiple new insulin pump systems with automated insulin delivery features, and these have revolutionized type 1 diabetes. Likewise, multiple approvals for new continuous glucose monitors. And one thing that was relatively unique in the US was approval for a nonprofit developed, open source, smartphone controlled, interoperable automated glycemic controller. Basically an app on a smartphone that would drive the interaction between a continuous glucose monitor, and an insulin pump. And the reason this is so important is it creates a path by which there could be greater access to this kind of technology in settings where resources are limited. There have been global approvals for more biosimilar insulins, and this hopefully will drive the price of insulin down. I know it's less of a problem in India than in the United States, but nevertheless, finance is a major limitation to management of diabetes and insulin therapy in particular, which is life-saving in the setting of type 1 diabetes. I think the big thing that people are concerned about is we really have a lack of data on the remarkable effects of GLP-1 receptor agonists and SGLT2 inhibitors in the setting of type 1 diabetes, specifically for management of obesity, management of cardiovascular disease, chronic kidney disease, and heart failure. But I would just say in the United States, we recently had the approval of sotagliflozin, and also with the GLP-1 receptor agonists, as they are available for obesity, they don't have a contraindication for use in type 1 diabetes. So there's a little bit of regulatory wiggle room for starting to consider using these therapies in type 1 diabetes as well. The one publication that I highlighted at the ADA meeting as being particularly important in type 1 diabetes was a publication in the New England Journal on a bionic pancreas. This is manufactured by a small company called Beta Bionics, and the data are quite impressive. If you look on the left panel, this looks at the change from baseline to week 13 in hemoglobin A1C on the y-axis, and on the x-axis, what the baseline hemoglobin A1C is. And I found this very elucidating. If you look in the standard care group, which were on a mixture of multiple daily injections and insulin pumps, you can see that they didn't have a lot of change as they continued with their current therapy being adjusted by the diabetes experts that ran the individual sites in the trial. In the red dots, you don't see a whole lot of change from baseline to week 13. And in the blue line, you see dramatic changes in people with the highest A1Cs and less dramatic changes in those with near target A1Cs. And I hadn't really thought this through completely before, but the recognition is that if you have a device that targets a fasting glucose or a glucose of 110 milligrams per deciliter, it kind of makes sense that everybody would approach a hemoglobin A1C of about 7%. And so we see this displayed in a different way on the right-hand panel, where the patients with the hemoglobin A1C less than 7% with the bionic pancreas in blue had minimal change in the hemoglobin A1C. And as you go to higher and higher levels of baseline hemoglobin A1C, you see greater A1C reductions from baseline and a greater difference versus the standard care group. In gestational diabetes, there were two very important papers published in the last year in the New England Journal. The first randomized women at 24 to 32 weeks gestation to be evaluated for gestational diabetes with the use of either lower or higher glycemic criteria. The higher criteria are the current criteria used in New Zealand, and the lower ones derived from the HAPO study of gestational diabetes conducted largely in the United States. And you see that the fasting glucose levels and the 2-hour glucose levels were lower, and there was an additional criteria of 180 milligrams per deciliter at 1 hour. Meeting any of those cut points or glucose levels greater than what's displayed here would result in a diagnosis of gestational diabetes. Though the overall conclusion of the trial was the use of lower glycemic criteria for the diagnosis of gestational diabetes did not result in a lower risk of large for gestational age infants than the use of the higher glycemic criteria. There was, however, a subgroup analysis of women who received a diagnosis of this milder degree of gestational diabetes and therefore received treatment compared to those who didn't receive a diagnosis of mild gestational diabetes and therefore had no treatment. In that subgroup, they demonstrated a lower risk of delivering a large for gestational age infant with a number needed to treat of only 4, as well as a lower risk of preeclampsia. And if you have an interest in focus in gestational diabetes, I would suggest taking a very close look at this paper. It has many interesting subgroup analyses and other features, particularly in the supplemental materials. I think this is going to be a guideline-changing paper. And the second one, randomized women between week 4 and 19 weeks and 6 days, or up to 17 weeks, gestation who had a risk factor for hyperglycemia and a diagnosis of gestational diabetes to receive immediate treatment for gestational diabetes or to be deferred or not get any treatment depending on the results of a repeat oral glucose tolerance test at the usual time of 24 to 28 weeks gestation. And what they showed was that immediate treatment of gestational diabetes before 20 weeks gestation led to a modestly lower incidence of a composite of adverse neonatal outcomes than no immediate treatment. So again, this has lots of details with regards to subgroup analyses. And again, if you're focused in gestational diabetes or it's a substantial part of your practice, I would suggest that you take a careful look at that paper. And then with regards to complications, I think the big news of the last year was broader indications of use for dapagliflozin and empagliflozin for the treatment of cardiorenal disease with or without diabetes. So these were developed as diabetes drugs, but now they're drugs for generically chronic kidney disease and heart failure. There have been many developments in the non-alcoholic fatty liver disease or non-alcoholic steatohepatitis space, and these developments have not resulted in FDA approval, but in the guidelines that have come from the American Association on Liver Disease, there is a suggestion for consideration of use of GLP-1 receptor agonist and thiazolidinediones for management of non-alcoholic steatohepatitis. Also, the guidelines and statements, particularly from the American Diabetes Association, but I think more globally, have really tried to align themselves. And as a result, specifically to the American Diabetes Association, they now have endorsed a lower blood pressure target less than 130 and lipid targets in patients in secondary prevention less than an LDL of 50. And in type 2 diabetes, there's been progress across a broad front of drug development. Once weekly insulin, which I'm not going to talk about, is very exciting, particularly in the management of type 2 diabetes. But in the GLP-1 receptor agonist space, oral small molecule agonists and the combination of multiple agents or even a triple single peptide agonist approach for diabetes and obesity, which I'll talk about more, as well as these advances in guidelines and statements, which I will also deal with in some detail. So I think the publication that I highlighted was really this consensus report from the American Diabetes Association, the European Association for the Study of Diabetes, published late in 2022. I'm sure you've seen it. This is the central figure and the face page from Diabetes Care. And I would just point out some of the important new features in 2022 was a greater focus on the social determinants of health, recognizing that people that are not responding appropriately to the therapies that you prescribe, often it's related to factors in their life that you may not be aware of, like food insecurity or difficulty affording medications, interventions, tests, etc. With regards to the initial therapy of type 2 diabetes, no longer is it just metformin. The language from the ADA now and EASD is to choose approaches that provide the efficacy to achieve goals. So if a patient's A1C is higher, you may want to start with a combination therapy product or two agents at the same time. But whatever approach you use should, at initial therapy, your notion should be it should be adequate to control diabetes and reach the other goals of therapy. And the goals of diabetes care from this consensus statement are much broader, not just glycemic goals, but also specifically weight goals and cardiorenal risk reduction in high-risk individuals, as well as cardiovascular risk factor management. So functionally, we have 4 goals in the treatment of type 2 diabetes, not just A1C. With regards to weight, there's specific language that when considering glucose-lowering therapies, consider regimens with high to very high dual glucose and weight effects. And the reason for that is a greater recognition of the effect of weight on glycemic management and cardiovascular and cardiorenal risk reduction, but also the associated comorbidities, specifically non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, steatohepatitis, and sleep apnea. There's a greater focus on 24-hour behaviors, including sleep, and a call for more attention in clinical trials, but also in clinical practice on specific issues for youth with type 2 diabetes, as well as elders with frailty and issues around race, ethnicity, and gender. So to highlight a bit on some of the additional presentations at the American Diabetes Association, I was going to deal with this issue of choosing approaches that provide the efficacy to achieve goals. And there was a lovely debate between Ralph DeFronzo and David Nathan around the question of, are 2 better than 1 drug in combination therapy in type 2 diabetes? And Dr. DeFronzo started off with the yes answer to the question. And he pointed out that it really does depend on the agents that are selected. So you want to use agents that correct underlying defects, specifically the insulin resistance and insulin secretory defects in diabetes. They should also provide organ protection, specifically cardiovascular protection, renal protection, and liver protection. And he posited that the approach of just starting with 1 drug is really a treat to fail approach. Namely, that we know that if you start a patient on 1 drug after 3 to 5 years, the A1C will be back to where you were when you initially started therapy. And this is amplified by clinical inertia, where we know that it often takes 5, even 10 years for the pair of the provider and the patient to move forward in advancing therapies from 1 agent to 2 agents in the face of a failure of glycemic control. And in a really, kind of an aggressive touch, recognizing that Dr. David Nathan was going to do the other side of the argument, he picked one of Dr. Nathan's recent publications, the GRADE study, and showed that in the GRADE study, independent of what the therapy that was added to metformin in patients who had an A1C over 7.5%, whether it was sitagliptin, glimepiride, liraglutide, or glargine, picking a single agent resulted in the majority of patients having a sustained hemoglobin A1C greater than 7% just at 4 years. On the con side, or arguing against starting with 2 agents, Dr. Nathan pointed out that sequential medication addition allows determination of the individual medication's efficacy and side effects. And this can be an important issue. Sometimes when you start a patient on 2 drugs and there's an adverse effect, you're a little bit unsure which drug to stop. And sometimes you actually have to stop both, or you may sort of poison the patient to the notion that this drug is something that you can take in the future. He also pointed out that by sequentially adding medications, it gives you more flexibility as compared to some of the combination products that are available, and thereby promotes the individualization for what you perceive as the individual needs of a patient. He also pointed out that it's parsimonious, and because of that, giving people just enough medication, it could be more cost effective and create less burden for patients. And he finally pointed out that we have lots of data about the effect of adding single agents, where there are very few trials that have looked at two agents as initial therapy right from the get-go. Now, there is a really well-done study of the combination of vildagliptin plus metformin versus vildagliptin alone. And in that study, they showed that the combination versus metformin alone, the combination was associated with greater duration of efficacy in combination therapy. But in any case, I don't think they collaborated to end up doing the same thing. Dr. Nathan attacked Dr. DeFronzo's arguments by showing one of Dr. DeFronzo's studies, the EDIC study, which compared a sequential program of starting patients on metformin, and if needed, because the A1C was greater than 7%, adding a sulfonylurea, and if needed, then adding insulin glargine, versus an initial combination therapy right at diagnosis of metformin plus pioglitazone plus exenatide in the twice daily formulation. And you see on the left the effect on glycemia, where the combination approach won with the hemoglobin A1C of 6%. But frankly, the conventional approach did quite well with the hemoglobin A1C of 6.5%. And he further pointed out that if you look at the adverse or other outcomes, there wasn't a difference in severe hypoglycemia, though there was more mild hypoglycemia in the sequential group. The weight change was moderate, 4 kilograms in the sequential group versus a loss of 1 kilogram in the combination. Now, to be fair, this was not exactly a comparison of one strategy, either starting everything at the same time or doing it sequentially. The differences in hypoglycemia and weight are really driven by the differences in the drugs in the various combinations. The combination group had more GI side effects, more edema, and what he really focused on was the greater cost. So the estimate was from the United States, the cost per year of starting combination therapy in the 1.5 million patients with new onset diabetes in the US would be about $22 billion annually. The situation would be very different in India, and I think the important consideration here is that this is really not a comparison of initial combination therapy versus sequential. It's really a comparison of two different drug strategies in managing diabetes. But in any case, I thought it was a great debate, and I heard lots of conversation in the halls about it. And for the rest of the talk, I really want to focus on the weight issues in type 2 diabetes. This whole change in the ADA-EASD consensus is really driven by the recent availability of tirzepatide. And just to point out, in a head-to-head study with semaglutide at the 1 milligram dose, tirzepatide was associated with nearly twice the efficacy with regards to percent change in body weight, 13% versus 6.7%. But more importantly, getting over the 10% mark in type 2 diabetes management really creates the opportunity for remission in patients with type 2 diabetes. We know from the direct study, for instance, the 10% weight loss is associated with on the order of 60% of patients being able to achieve remission. And at least for those that maintain their weight loss, a substantial proportion of those patients maintaining the remission for a prolonged period of time. And then a subsequent study subsequent sort of opinion piece by Ildiko Lingvay and colleagues published in The Lancet late in 2022 suggested that we think about diabetes as really three different kinds of disorders. One, adiposity-related diabetes, which is the majority of cases, and then diabetes with cardiovascular disease, and isolated hyperglycemia. This is one of my favorite papers of 2022, and if you haven't read it, I would certainly suggest that you do. But for this majority of patients with adiposity-related diabetes, they posited that the focus of the management should really be weight-centric, aiming for 15% weight loss, but as secondary targets, recognizing that you want to manage glucose and the cardiovascular risk factors as well. So at the ADA meeting, there were a number of presentations on advances around pharmacotherapy in patients with diabetes targeting weight loss. So the Pioneer Plus study was a study of the efficacy and safety of once daily oral semaglutide, 25 milligrams and 50 milligrams compared with the approved dose in the United States of 14 milligrams. And it was published online last week in The Lancet. Very briefly, the trial design was patients with type 2 diabetes with an A1C between 8 and 10.5%. They picked that higher level of A1C so that these higher doses and more efficacy of oral semaglutide were able to demonstrate that greater efficacy. All the patients had a BMI greater than 25, and they could be up to 3 oral anti-diabetic agents. And the patients that were on DPP-4 inhibitors at baseline had to be willing to discontinue the DPP-4 inhibitor at randomization. The doses of oral semaglutide were titrated, obviously, to get to the 15 milligram dose with monthly escalations that required 16 weeks of therapy to get to the 50 milligram dose. And so the primary endpoint at 52 weeks really reflects less than a year at the highest dose of oral semaglutide. And what they found was a statistically significant further reduction in hemoglobin A1C, 2% versus 1.5% at the highest dose of oral semaglutide. And when you looked at the trial product estimate, which is patients who were able to take the drug and continue on the drug through the entire 52 weeks of follow-up, the differences were greater with a 2.2% reduction with the 50 milligram dose. And with regards to body weight, a much greater proportional effect on body weight, with nearly a doubling of the weight loss associated with the highest dose of oral semaglutide at 50 milligrams, producing 8 kilograms of weight loss versus 4.4 with the 14 milligram dose of oral semaglutide. And on the right, when you use the trial product estimate in people who were able to take the full dose and continue on it during the trial, a 9.2 kilogram weight loss. And with regards to safety, I'm not showing you all the safety data just for issues of time, but there was a higher incidence of gastrointestinal disorders. But when we look at the sort of the more important adverse effects, things like gallbladder disease, pancreatitis, malignant neoplasm, specifically thyroid cancer, and diabetic retinopathy, as well as kidney disease, there really weren't meaningful differences between the groups. There was another paper published online at the same time as the presentation, looking at a new product, a co-administered combination of cagrilintide and once-weekly semaglutide subcutaneous injections. And in that study, the patients had type 2 diabetes. They could have an A1C between 7.5 and 10. They could be on metformin with or without an SGLT2 inhibitor, and they had to have a BMI of greater than 27. And they were randomized to either the combination product, CardiSema, each at 2.4 milligrams, or just semaglutide 2.4 milligrams, or just cagrilintide 2.4 milligrams. Each had a dose escalation, or the semaglutide had a dose escalation in the trial. The baseline hemoglobin A1C was 8.4%, and the mean body weight just over 100 kilos. And this is the change in hemoglobin A1C from baseline. You see the combination product in dark blue is associated with the greatest reduction in A1C, around 2%, substantially greater than the cagrilintide and similar, though greater than semaglutide alone. But more importantly, with regards to body weight, you see that semaglutide in the 2.4 milligram dose provided about 5% weight loss. There is a bit of a decline still going on. Cagrilintide at the 2.4 milligram dose is associated with ongoing weight loss and greater than semaglutide alone, but the combination provided for substantial reductions in weight, 15.6% weight loss. But as you can see, there's no evidence of any slowing of the weight loss at 32 weeks. And it's really exciting to think about what the weight loss might be in patients followed out for a year or a year and a half or 2 years, and in patients with higher BMIs even than in the trial. So, what could this combination do for patients with a BMI of 50 or greater? With regards to adverse events, in general, they were more or less as we see in other kinds of trials involving these gut peptides. The serious adverse events were quite uncommon, and AEs leading to drug withdrawal. There was only one in the semaglutide group. With regards to gastrointestinal adverse events, you can see that the combination product CardiSema was associated with substantially more patients experiencing gastrointestinal adverse events than either agent alone. But again, just as a reminder, there were really no patients who withdrew drug related to adverse events with CardiSema. And then a very exciting and maybe the most anticipated result of the American Diabetes Association was retatrutide, which is a so-called triple G agonist. So it's a GIP, GLP-1, and glucagon receptor agonist. The Banting Award was given to Matthias Chopp, and in his study, he acknowledged the collaboration of his longstanding collaborator Richard DeMarchi, and basically described the process of developing this peptide, which is remarkable in that about half of the amino acids in the peptide are shared across all three, and a smaller proportion are unique to GIP, unique to GLP-1, and unique to glucagon. And then it has the tail of the exenatide molecule providing for greater durability. And in that trial, again, published online in The Lancet, at 24 weeks, retatrutide at the maximum dose of 12 milligrams was associated with an A1C change of 2% versus 1.4% with dulaglutide, the currently available molecule at 1.5 milligram dose. And at 36 weeks, retatrutide at the 12 milligram dose was associated with nearly 17% body weight loss as compared to 2% with dulaglutide 1.5 milligrams. Now, remember, dulaglutide is not among the most effective GLP-1 receptor agonists with regards to weight, but still a really impressive result. And without showing you the figures, they're available online. There was evidence of persistent weight loss at 36 weeks, suggesting that, again, if we waited 2 years and we started with people with a BMI of 50, there's no telling how much weight loss we might achieve. And lastly, a disclosure on orforglipron, a oral small molecule GLP-1 receptor agonist. So as opposed to oral semaglutide, which is a peptide with an absorption enhancer, complicated to take, this is a small molecule, like aspirin. It's a chemical and can be taken quite conveniently. This was a phase 2 study And at week 26, orforglipron at the highest dose, 45 milligrams, provided for greater than 2% A1C change versus 1.1% with dulaglutide, 1.5 milligrams, a very effective glucose lowering dose. And at week 26, orforglipron at the 45 milligram dose provided for 10.1 kilograms of weight loss, again, substantially greater than dulaglutide, 1.5 milligrams. So for many patients and for many providers, this molecule, should it prove to be safe and effective in the phase 3 program, really may provide for a convenient oral agent for the management of type 2 diabetes and obesity. And in a session where Ildiko Lyngve reviewed or provided a discussion of one of these agents, she pointed out that many more agents are being studied now for the management of type 2 diabetes and obesity broadly in this area. And they include GLP-1 receptor agonists, dual and triple agonists, as well as other approaches. I highlighted the ones that I discussed today in red, but you can see that most of the agents on this slide are not in red. They're actually in black, and there will be many, many more disclosures to come. So what I think is going to change in the diabetes world as we know it over the next year, first with regards to teplizumab, what I started with, it's really going to focus our efforts on screening for stage 1 and stage 2 type 1 diabetes before frank hyperglycemia and the need for insulin therapy starts. That is going to be a substantial change in our approach, and we need to sort out how to do that, recognizing that 90% of people with type 1 diabetes do not have a family history. Are we going to move towards newborn screening for genes for future disease risk, specifically in type 1 diabetes, using something like a type 1 diabetes genetic risk score? The bionic pancreas disclosure that I told you about really lowers the barriers to automated insulin delivery systems for type 1 diabetes care. I didn't tell you why. But the reason why is that the only input you need to start a bionic pancreas in a patient with type 1 diabetes is their weight. The algorithm in the chip within the pump will take care of the rest, determining what the duration of insulin is for the patient, determining what the optimal insulin to carb ratio is, determining what the correction factor is. And therefore, if you compare to a primary care doctor trying to address the dosing of 2 different formulations of insulin in a new patient with type 1 diabetes, this is infinitely easier, though substantially more expensive, but infinitely easier than multiple daily injections in type 1 diabetes. As I mentioned, I do believe the gestational diabetes guidelines are likely to be tweaked with regards to screening for gestational diabetes, what the cut points are and when we should do them. And these developments in obesity management that I told you about in detail, or in some detail, are really exciting. But what will change the world potentially is the disclosure of the SELECT trial at the American Heart Association meeting in November. To remind you, that's the cardiovascular outcome trial for semaglutide, the injected formulation in the setting of obesity at 2.4 milligrams. So the study is wrapped up, and the disclosure, I think the date is November 13th. I'm sure it'll be in your newspapers in India shortly thereafter. Thanks for listening.
Thank you so much, sir, for that wonderful endearing session. We now hand over to our esteemed moderator and our expert Indian panelist for an open-ended panel discussion. Kalra, sir, over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Buse. Very lucid and a very interesting presentation, and you've been able to put things in a nutshell for us. Professor Ganpati, your comments. What is it that is most important for India?
Yeah, one thing is, I think if teplizumab comes, it'll be a at least we could delay that. We don't have good molecules for new onset or just before the onset of type 1 diabetes. So that will be a real good thing. And of course, the obesity things are really will become a game changer because we have a lot of obese people now. And I think because when we say them 5% weight loss is enough, they're not happy. They want 20%, 25%. Then the only option was bariatric surgery. And now at least you have these molecules up to 15, 20% weight reduction happening with that. I think that's also a great thing. And as you rightly told, in the management of the common type of type 2 diabetes, that classification which you told, adiposity based, your thinking should be different, diabetes with CVD, and then only isolated hypoglycemia. I think, that approach also we should develop from a clinical point of view, what medications to be used. That's a good thing. And of course, as you told, gestational diabetes, last but not the least, a game changer, perhaps. Then it could change the guidelines also. Yeah, rightly told.
So let's go through these one by one and let's look at it from a public health perspective, perhaps. Type 1 diabetes, Dr. Buse, how common is that in the US? And is it becoming more and more frequent? Is the incidence of type 1 diabetes rising in the US?
It is rising in the United States, but still it's relatively uncommon. The statistics are it's about 5% of all of diabetes. We probably are underestimating that. There are some adults that are being treated for type 2 diabetes who, if you very carefully looked, they probably do have latent autoimmune diabetes of adults or, functionally type 1 diabetes. The estimate is that in new onset patients with type 2 new onset diabetes in adults, even 70-year-olds and 80-year-olds, that 5% of those cases are latent autoimmune diabetes. And we do need to do a better job of screening for type 1 diabetes at diagnosis, particularly in people who present with weight loss or people that you start on metformin or a GLP-1 receptor agonist and they don't have the sort of robust 1 to 2% reduction in hemoglobin A1C that you're expecting with initial therapy. So it is it's a minority. It's not the most important public health issue, but this is all about sort of precision medicine and getting the right drug to the right patient at the right time. For people with type 1 diabetes, that's insulin.
Thanks. Dr. Ganpati, you have clinical experience across the length and breadth of the country. Is there actually a latitude axis or a latitude gradient as you move away from the equator towards the north, towards the Himalayas? Does the incidence of autoimmune disease rise, specifically celiac disease, type 1 diabetes, and LADA? Have you experienced that in practice?
Yeah, definitely. I did my post-graduation from Chandigarh, where we used to see a lot of celiac diseases. The same thing lower down, we are actually not finding. If you take autoimmune thyroid disorders, I would say it's the same. There's not much of a difference. Its prevalence will be the same. And maybe for type 1 also, I think as you go north, you are actually finding more incidents than in the south. And now that with the onset of COVID, I think post-COVID also, we are finding a slight increase in the numbers of type 1 diabetes also. I agree with that.
There is anecdotal evidence and also evidence from our 3 published data sets in India, which seems to suggest that North India has a greater than its fair burden of type 1 diabetes. But Dr. Ganpati, Dr. Buse spoke about the importance of recognizing LADA. So 2 or 3 take-home points for our audience, our physicians. In which adult should I suspect LADA?
Yeah, so
go ahead.
Yeah, carry on, Dr. Ganpati first, and then we'll come back to Dr. Buse.
Yeah. So number one is, say you have a patient who is lean built, say you have a BMI of say 20, 21, who is also having other signs of autoimmunity, like say you have a vitiligo, you have an autoimmune thyroid disorder, you started him on a metformin or an SUs, and you find he's requiring insulin quickly, he's losing weight, you put him on another medication, 3-drug regimen over. So by around a year or 2 or 3 years, you find that it continues to have uncontrolled diabetes, losing weight, not significant family history, no family history. I think these are the patients we should start suspecting for latent autoimmune diabetes of the adults. So look for these signs, and then actually you could actually start them on insulin from the beginning. And a simple way is you could get a C-peptide and a GAD antibody and just see whether he has that or not.
Thanks.
And I might add, there's an ancient study from the Mayo Clinic. It's probably 20 years old now, where they compared in adults the presentation of people who were eventually determined to have type 1 diabetes versus type 2 diabetes. And in addition to the points that Dr. Ganpathy made, the other issues were people who present with ketones, urine ketones would be quite unusual in patients with type 2 diabetes. And the second would be people who present with weight loss. We think of the, diabetes mellitus, the siphon that, sucks your water and your weight out of you. It doesn't tend to happen in type 2 diabetes, but it is more common in people with type 1 diabetes. So weight loss and urine ketones.
There is a comment from Dr. Prathamesh, and let me continue with this comment. One way of differentiating between LADA and type 2 diabetes in Northwest India is to just look at the patient, the phenotype. If the patient has a stocky Indian phenotype, dark-colored hair, black eyes, overall a metabolic syndrome kind of a build, and the family members have the same, it's usually going to be type 2. But if your patient happens to have a blue or gray or green eyes, which is not uncommon in Northwest India, light-colored hair, is relatively fair as per that particular ethnic group and gender, is fairer, more handsome, or more beautiful, the chances of an autoimmune etiology are more. And if you're working in Northwest India, you can make that out very easily, because Northwest India, Dr. Buse, is an amalgam of many ethnicities. People came in from Turkey and then Iran and Afghanistan, Greece before that. So we've been a melting point of the entire world, at least the Asiatic world, for the past 2,000 years or so. So you can actually make out what is the predominant etiology just looking at the color of the eyes.
So I see in the chat a couple of interesting questions. Dr. Iyengar talks about the pioglitazone in patients with diabetes and NASH, as well as vitamin D in non-diabetic patients with NASH. And just a reminder in that regard, so in the new guidelines in the United States, there is a recommendation to consider using as diabetes therapy pioglitazone and perhaps a GLP-1 receptor agonist or a GLP-1 receptor agonist in the setting of NASH. But he points out the possibility of using dapagliflozin with pioglitazone in NASH to amplify the effect. In the ADA ESD statement, we pointed out that there is some evidence of reduction in liver fat with SGLT2 inhibitors, but not any evidence yet with regards to fibrosis. But I do think that is a combination that will be studied, and particularly in India, where both classes of drugs are very inexpensive as compared to GLP-1 receptor agonists. That's something that's a fairly compelling thing to look at, particularly in India.
Dr. Buse, how frequently does this happen in medicine? The wheel coming around 360 degrees. It was just about 15 years ago that the glitazones were considered the bad boys of diabetes.
Yeah, there was a lot, I think there's a lot of confusion about that. So I think part of the problem was when they were first launched, they were marketed that by reducing insulin resistance, they would have profound effects on cardiovascular risk. And it turned out not to be so profound, and particularly with rosiglitazone, some concerns. The fluid retention and heart failure, particularly in the setting of unrecognized HFpEF, is a problem, but it can be managed. The second issue was the reports of bladder cancer, but recognize that's an extremely rare event. And so if you have a doubling of the risk of bladder cancer, it amounts to something on the order of one extra case per 1,000 people. if you have a compelling indication like NASH, you just need to weigh the risks and benefits. And the last thing I would point out from the, I can't remember the name of the trial, but the IRIS, the trial of pioglitazone in the setting of post-stroke patients, in the patients that took 15 or 30 milligrams, the incidence of adverse effects was quite low. And so I think many people are looking at the possibility of using lower doses of pioglitazone, where you seem to have much less adverse effects and nearly full efficacy.
And IRIS was in non-diabetic and pre-diabetic individuals.
Right.
Dr. Ganpati, your take on this. As men of science, we must be passionate. We should be passionate about science. See the feeling we get from Dr. Buse from so far away. You want to learn new things, you want to explore, you want to improve. At the same time, when you read the data, you should be dispassionate. For personal egos, for personal whims and fancies, you should not get carried away by being pro-drug or anti-drug or pro-molecule, anti-molecule. Unfortunately, that is actually what happens to some men of science across the world. Dr. Ganpati, your take on this rational use of pioglitazone in India going forward?
There was a lot of problem when pioglitazone went off because it was banned for 3 months. I found so many people coming back. They're not, their blood glucose control went haywire. It went to 400, 500, and we had to start them on insulin. They searched all the markets to just keep a stock of that medication. But fortunately, after 3 months, the ban was revoked. I would still continue to use in the younger diabetics because it's highly durable along with metformin with a pioglitazone. The younger ones, they're very durable. I'm talking type 2 only. You start them on this, it's like a fill it, forget it. It's like that. You just start them on this. They are very well controlled for a couple of years or more without A1C being very well controlled. So such a great drug. The only effect is a little bit of weight gain can happen, but that is countered by the full dose of metformin. So I continue to use, and nowadays a lot of this pioglitazone I'm actually using for NASH related thing. I think NASH is an under treated condition by the endocrinologist. We should do a FIB score and maybe send for a fibroscan and see where it is. When it is high, of course, you refer them to the gastroenterologist. But otherwise, we have a great role because NASH, insulin resistance, is a component of the multi-hit therapy for that. It is linked to CVD also. I think we could use this drug more often in these type of patients. It goes a long way actually in helping them. Most commonest cause of cryptogenic cirrhosis.
Mm-hmm. Even when I look at my practice over the past 15 years or so, pioglitazone has continued. Though we have faced a lot of backlash and a lot of criticism. In India, Dr. Buse, there is something known as academic casteism. So it depends upon where you are in the hierarchy of education. Accordingly, you decide what you want to say. That was speaking about passion and dispassion in science. I would like to counsel our colleagues that the commonest contraindication I find in my clinic for pioglitazone is not CA bladder, it's not weight gain, it's not heart failure. It is actually proliferative diabetic retinopathy. So just do a fundus before you initiate pioglitazone. Otherwise, it is a fill the prescription and forget the prescription kind of a drug, the way Dr. Ganpati has said. Dr. Ganpati, if you could take the next 2 comments, please, from Dr. Prathamesh regarding use of sulfonylureas in India in the modern era. And secondly, from Dr. Rajneesh, asking for more information about retatrutide and also orforglipron, though I understand that all of us struggle with the names. I wish these pharma people could figure out simpler names for us. So, okay. Dr. Ganpati, if you could continue with the conversation, you and Dr. Buse.
I will talk with the SUs. Yeah, SUs still have a role. See, we are not, Indians are the thin fat Indians. We are not very obese. We don't have very obese patients. We have a BMI of say 23 to 25 is overweight for us. So in this setting, after metformin, if you find somebody having an A1C of around 9%, a little bit of losing weight, of course, no ketones, I think there is a role for sulfonylurea still in our country, at least. We are not like the US where all are more than 30% BMI, not you, sir. But then that is how it is. So there is definitely a role. Of course, in the elderly and all, use with caution. Use a smaller dose. Maybe then say you have a CKD where you can't use metformins and other things. You could use glipizide like of medications, smaller doses where you can't use it. Of course, insulin will be the best medication, but then if they're unwilling, then in these type also you could actually use the SUs. So there is still a role for SUs. Yes, the order of preference has come down, but it is not going to die down. You still require to use it. So there is a role for that. And then the next is role of metformin or voglibose in India. Yeah, see, what happens is we are all a carbohydrate eating country. 65%, we did the START study, 65% carbohydrate intake from all, west, south, north, east, central. So here we have a great role for voglibose or acarbose. Of course, not in the west, like the US, where very little carbohydrate is consumed. So that they may not be. That's why it's not there in the guidelines. But I think in India, to control postprandial hyperglycemia, we require to use this role. Definitely role for metformin is there. That's not removed yet. Of course, a trend is coming where we could use even before metformin, the other medications if they have an ASCVD, but then metformin continues to be the first line as of now. Dr. Buse, do you want to take that thing on retatrutide showing 24% weight loss or for glyperon being a non-weight, a little bit about that?
Yeah. So just to double down on what you said about sulfonylureas and voglibose, I agree completely. I think for me, the key issue with sulfonylureas is at low doses, they have remarkable efficacy and very little side effect. If you find yourself going to a high dose, you start thinking about using something else. And Dr. Pratmash, the doctor suggested as third line therapy, and I do think in India, where SGLT2 inhibitors and DPP4 inhibitors are very inexpensive, as third-line therapies, certainly the sulfonylureas are appropriate. And regarding retatrutide, the weight loss was spectacular, and we don't really know again what the weight loss would be at 2 years in people with a BMI of 50. But I bet it would be above 30%, so on par with bariatric surgery. That and CagriSema probably have similar effects. And the non-peptide therapy will, in India, will be a complete game changer, with regards to your ability to produce medications at a very low cost. It will help democratize GLP-1 therapy and not make it just a therapy for rich people in rich countries.
Yeah. Dr. Partha?
Yes, sir.
Any other questions?
So we have neared the end of our questions, and we take this August opportunity to thank Dr. Bose, Dr. Kalra, as well as yourself for the wonderful talk and the wonderful discussion that followed. Professor Bose, it's been an honor to have you invited here in India and to hear from you the best of science and what is new out there in the world, so that we can probably wait for those agents as well as probably implement some of those takeaways here in India. Dear Bandwal sir, it's been an honor to host you, and also Dr. Kalra, who very wonderfully brought forth those perspectives into what can be done right here, downright in the Indian scenario. We've had a very engaging audience, which has actually turned out on a Sunday at 9 p.m. to ask these questions. So it's been an honor. And dear audience, we thank you too for joining in at this particular point of time. And we're very sure that the takeaways from these sessions would ultimately empower you in your clinical practice and possibly lead to better patient care and such outcomes. Last but not the least, we also thank Mr. Raghu from Club Class, our technology partners, for aiding in the very smooth streaming of this webinar. Thank you, one and all. Good day and good night.
Goodbye, Dr. Buse.
Goodbye. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.